NDN POV confronts settler colonial violence, which may be distressing for some viewers. Please watch with care.
I don't know how many deer or wolves you've run into. They don't tell a lot of stories. They're purely in existence. Humans have this weird thing where we're in sort of a bunch of different times all at once. And we tell stories in order to navigate that consciousness. We're the animal that tells stories.
Stories inspire us, bring us together, and help us achieve incredible things, like putting humans on the moon.
That's one small step for man.
The thing is, stories can also be damaging. They can be manipulated to divide us, justify wars, and enable atrocities. Powerful stories shape the world that we live in, for better or for worse.
For far too long, we have had other people telling our stories, and it's time we started telling our stories ourselves.
There's this long history of stories that have dehumanized us and reinforced these negative stereotypes.
The story that is largely told by colonial settler states is mythical. They are not actually interested in history.
Settler colonization of the Americas has relied on myths, like the savage Indian, to justify the displacement of indigenous peoples, ease colonial guilt, and portray colonizers as heroes for their so-called discovery of the Americas. The success of these myths has required the suppression of indigenous narrative sovereignty, our right to tell our own stories on our own terms.
Our narrative sovereignty has been violently attacked for the entirety of the colonial experiment.
To deprive us of land, to deprive us of the language, to deprive us of our children. These are the things that stood in the way of a Canadian colonial project.
In the War of 1812, British colonials relied on strategic alliances with indigenous nations to defend their territory against American expansion. Yet, when that British colony became Canada, the savage Indian got a reboot to justify policies of assimilation, which in reality meant committing acts of genocide. Meanwhile, Canada portrayed itself as a peaceful, multicultural nation, free from the injustices of its colonial past, and a defender of human rights.
We are one of the most stable regimes in history. There are very few countries that can say for nearly 150 years they've had the same political system without any social breakdown, political upheaval, or invasion. We also have no history of colonialism.
You can't tell a story to where Canada stole everything, to where they signed treaties and then broke them immediately, to where they killed children to benefit the state. That's not the story you tell to form national unity. That's a story you tell if you want people to really criticize your country and be like, are you even a legitimate country? Southern states don't want questions of legitimacy ever. They actually know deeply they're not legitimate.
Over time, the savage Indian evolved into the noble savage. Indigenous peoples were romanticized as relics of the past, primitive, pure, and untouched by the modern world. This was, of course, another way of dehumanizing Indigenous peoples, confining them to the past while denying their presence in the modern world. Genocide was reimagined as the tragic fate of the noble savage, or the vanishing Indian. Those who continued to exist were still considered savage, and they were heavily surveilled by police as possible threats to public safety.
We should, as members, condemn in the strongest terms the threat of those rogue chiefs who are threatening the security of Canadians, their families, and taxpayers.
We've only ever been noble because our demise was inevitable. We're not noble when we're defending our lands. No, then we're violent and angry.
In 1896, photographer Edward Curtis set out to document the vanishing Indian, resulting in over 40,000 images across 3 decades and a 20-volume book series. Curtis's work became the definitive representation of North American Indians during that era. The problem is that his photos were often staged to reflect colonial myths.
Edward Curtis told every one of his subjects not to smile. And that's where the icon of the Stoic Indian came from. Edward Curtis, who also, by the way, made sure we wore traditional dress for every photo.
Those same stereotypes and tropes, blah, 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 in cowboy movies or whatever it may be. Guess what? It's been on the front page of your newspaper. Representations that were intended to dehumanize us so that they didn't feel so guilty when they got on the TTC in the morning and went to work in an area of land that was once an Indigenous portage route.
It's so harmful. It affects everything. It affects how we see ourselves. It affects governments and policies. It affects our education. It affects our healthcare.
We need to start correcting the record, and that's where Indigenous narrative sovereignty comes in. You gotta understand the truth about this place, this country, if we're gonna get to that point of reconciliation.
Narrative sovereignty is central to the broader fight for Indigenous self-determination. Control over one's story is not just about the past, but also the future.
Some people equate narrative sovereignty with the idea that Indigenous people should only ever work with other Indigenous people. I always thought it was more about having the ability to choose. I'd be happy for anyone to tell our stories, but to do it properly.
They need to have some sort of cultural baseline that helps them understand how to tell our stories in a proper way. Cultural protocols to history, all those kinds of things.
That baseline starts with education, and the media plays a crucial role. By sharing accurate, respectful portrayals of Indigenous stories by Indigenous peoples, the media can help build bridges of empathy and knowledge. We could all use some NDN POV.
The media are named in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Our industry needs some reckoning. And that means young Indigenous people starting to get mics put in their hands and starting to feel the power of the media.
Through stories, we have the power to connect with people, to share hard truths about our country, to heal colonial trauma, to help build something that we can all be proud of being a part of.
Anything is possible, right? This is a species who went to the moon.
One giant leap for mankind.
Which means we can cure capitalism and colonialism and all these silly human systems, but people who have been the victims of these systems have not had storytelling power. So if Indigenous people, if Black people, if trans people, if all of these folks, these communities, could actually put our dreams out into the world, and those dreams can dance with other folks' dreams, then the future is born. And a future that isn't this, that isn't stuck here, that isn't the result of just a few people's dreams.
Nothing about us without us. Like, that's it. Done.